Given Joe Biden's recent polling slip against Donald Trump, conversations are stirring about why that is. And behind closed doors, Democrats are talking about the possibility of switching him off the ticket. Of course, a big problem that Biden has, whether he remains in the race or not, is his vice president, Kamala Harris. And so on Morning Joe, they made what I can only describe as a laughably desperate attempt to convince their audience that Kamala Harris is actually a great asset, not only to Biden's White House, but to his reelection campaign. And now that I just think of that last sentence, maybe desperate is not the right word, because their audience is dumb enough to actually swallow this, and I'm sure they did. But when you talk about in-the-bubble liberal media coverage, this is some of the worst since the run-up to the 2016 election where, oh, Trump will never be president. I mean, this is really Hall of Fame stuff. So let's watch this.
I have people telling me, Eddie Glaude Jr., they're like, okay, so he's he's old and you know. I know I don't know, because I want to make him say Kamala Harris's name. You know, if he's old and they're going to be looking at, I go, no, I don't know. Tell me. But it's always like, Kamala. What about Kamala?
What about her?
Well, there's sort of this undercurrent, like she's black and she's a woman, and that's why people don't like her, because she's a vice president. And what are we going to do?
Okay, we got to stop right there. I mean, just look at these idiots. Look at what a bunch of irrelevant losers they got on here. And actually, Eddie Glaude is by far the most substantive of the lot here, which is why it's a little surprising to see him swallow this line of bullshit, hook, line, and sinker. I guess he knows where his bread is buttered. That's Donnie Deutsch on the right there, who said famously that he would vote for Donald Trump if Bernie Sanders were the nominee, and then Joe Scarborough shut him up and said, no, you wouldn't. Come on, you can't say that. Joe Scarborough is a Republican himself. He was elected to Congress in 1994, so he's not a woke lib, so he knows better than to say what he just said. Oh yeah, it's that she's black and she's a woman. That's why Michelle Obama has an approval rating about 15 points higher than Joe Biden, right? So if Kamala is perceived as a drag on the ticket and people are concerned about her because she's a black woman, how do you explain the fact that Michelle Obama polls significantly ahead of Republican opponents, whereas Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both tank? I mean, he knows this. Joe Scarborough knows this. He's a Republican. This isn't the water in which he's swam his whole life. He's throwing red meat to the brain dead audience there, and these guys just swallow it. It's just incredible. Anything to add about that before we go on?
I thought this was an episode of Next Generation when you first went to that show.
Right. Exactly.
Lieutenant LaForge.
Yeah.
So you can't even, when you watch Morning Joe at this point, you can't even say they're just this stupid. This is their job, man. I mean, to spread elite Washington insider propaganda, to spin things according to that disposition. That's why it doesn't matter that Scarborough's a Republican. That doesn't matter. This is about it, because Trump is so unacceptable to this class that as we saw in the last two election cycles, they'll all become Democrats if the option is Donald Trump. They'll all run cover for whatever Democratic administration happens to be there. Do they believe this stuff? I don't think so. I mean, not what they're talking about right now. Like they just, just
I don't believe Scarborough believes it.
We need to change her. We need to. And I just go, where were you when Dan Quayle was vice president? Where were you? Nobody remembers this. George H.W. Bush, buried, sainted, like one of the greatest foreign policy presidents of the second half of the 20th century. That guy in
That
the
says you.
80s was destroyed by the press. Destroyed by the press. What about Al Gore? Every vice president.
Okay, stop. Dan Quayle was a joke. Yes, everybody said Dan Quayle was a joke. But when Dan Quayle was vice president, George H.W. Bush was in his mid-60s. Dan Quayle did not serve under a senile octogenarian. If he did, people would be much more alarmed about Dan Quayle. Al Gore was a punchline because he was boring and a stiff, and he was sort of the straight man to Bill Clinton's, first black president, quote unquote, saxophone shtick. And George H.W. Bush, to the extent that he was considered a clown or laughed at, but not really, not nearly to the extent that Harris is. And so he's just comparing apples and oranges. The most obvious point is that all of those vice presidents served not with the expectation that they would have to fill in, and the people did ultimately trust George H.W. Bush to fill in for Ronald Reagan because they voted him president in 1988.
Well, that's what's kind of disgraceful about these shows. You talk to people who consume a lot of this kind of media, and they pick up this kind of pattern, right? Like they're Washington insiders too, and that's the intention of the show, right? To make striving bourgeois losers check in on these shows to hear what the elite opinions are, and then they go repeat them to other striving libs. The substance of it, I don't know that they really care, right? I mean, I can't imagine Joe Scarborough believes what he's saying right now. Like, he's not this fundamentally stupid. Some of them are. He's not. To be making that comparison, he has to know what's wrong with this comparison. But he knows the audience will like it.
Right. He knows that they don't know, and he knows that they'll eat it up. Exactly.
Right. It's a political entertainment show, right?
Exactly.
As you say, Dan Quayle, if George Bush had been an 80-something senile man, Quayle would have been a real issue. In fact, given that our institutions were a little more robust back then, if that had been the case, first of all, a guy like that wouldn't have been president. But assuming that somebody like that was, they would have removed Quayle. They would have taken him out of office. Like they would have gotten him to step down.
Well,
they just would not have allowed it. And with Gore, nobody ever questioned that he was a good vice president to Bill Clinton. They joked around with him. It's called political humor. Like it was never like, oh God, I can't believe that guy's vice president. Not at all. Like that's an even worse comparison because Gore was never thought of as like a joke like that in that way. Like he shouldn't be vice president or he's incompetent. Nobody ever thought that about Al Gore.
No, they just thought that he was dull. But the HW comparison is interesting because Ronald Reagan did start to lose his mind in office, and people did trust George H.W. Bush enough to elect him president. Now, that's something they try to make the argument for in Kamala's case towards the end of this segment. And by the way, just so everybody knows, we did edit this segment for time. The raw video is about 5.5 minutes, so I did skip ahead of parts.
What about Al Gore? Every vice president. We hear this all the time. Change your vice presidents. I'm here to say it's total nonsense. Nobody's ever voted against any presidential candidate because who their vice president was. And if you look at Kamala's numbers, they're not that far off from where every other mocked and ridiculed and loathed vice president has been.
Agreed. Remember,
if you look at Kamala's numbers, they're not that far off from where every other mocked and ridiculed vice president has been. So you're saying she's not quite as good. She's only slightly worse than your average joke of a vice president. Well, that's obviously nowhere near good enough because, as we just said, Dan Quayle never became president. He never could become president. So the idea that, well, she's not that far off from Dan Quayle, yeah, that means she's never going to be elected president, which means you have a big problem because if you take Joe Biden off the ticket, you're going to have to find an excuse that takes her off the ticket as well, which we'll get to in a moment. But assuming you don't take Joe Biden off the ticket, you also have a problem because, and look, we don't want to get morbid or demonetized, so we will say that, we hope this doesn't happen, but actuarial tables being what they are, will say it is statistically likely that if Joe Biden is reelected, she will have to finish his term, right? And so that's why it's a problem either way. You can't get Biden off the ticket unless you can also take her off the ticket, because she can't win. And if you keep Biden on the ticket, people are afraid that she's going to have to take over, right? And they'd rather elect they'd trust their dog in the White House before they would trust her in the White House. So that's where this is a major problem, a major headache for Democrats who want to win right now. And the hidden truth here in all of this, and I've said this before in the show, and Russell has as well, this is the real reason why Biden picked Harris, because he knew that if he picked a competent vice president, they'd have forced him off the ticket a year ago. They'd have said, no way you're running for re-election. In fact, you're resigning now, and your VP is taking over. If Stacey Abrams, another black woman, just to show this is not about race or gender or anything, if a black woman or anybody else, any other VP capable of doing the job were in that VP role, Biden would have been out on his ass a year ago. But the reason why he's allowed to even contemplate running again is because he picked, I believe on purpose for this exact reason, a vice president that was just a complete non-starter. And now here these clowns are trying to make the case that she's not that much worse off than Dan Quayle. Dan Quayle? Are you kidding?
Compared to all the other lepers, she only has 2 less toes.
Right.
So what are we talking about here? Yeah, all of this is just such a load of horseshit. I mean, I understand they do a show 5 days a week. They got to talk a lot. But, this is you just wonder the mind of somebody who fucking still takes this seriously. And I mean, I guess we know who it is from the numbers on the viewers on MSNBC. I mean, it's elderly boomers.
Yeah. But how could you watch this? Here, they go on.
It's like a spike. It's like a spike in my head to watch this stuff.
Yeah, brutal.
Isn't his bad?
Agreed. Remember Potato with Dan Quayle?
Yeah, exactly.
Potato. But you're absolutely right. But I think going back to our earlier conversation, the cultural existential anxiety in the country makes this particular issue a little bit different. Right? The idea that the possibility of a black woman being the president, right, enters into that kind of swirl of grievance and concern. And so even David Ignatius...
See, this is the other line of bullshit that MSNBC has to toe, because they can't bring up the study or the citation by the Census Bureau that we just brought up at the top of the show, citing that people are poorer than they were at this time last year, and 83% of Americans feel the same or worse about their economic prospects than they did during the pandemic lockdowns. They cannot provide an economic analysis because their viewers are disproportionately represented in that 15% of people who do feel that they are better off because they have a PMC audience. And so they just have to recycle the same narrative that this is all about racial anxiety. This is all about fear of progress on the part of the deplorables, on the part of the rubes. The rubes just can't stomach a black woman in the Oval Office, and that's what this is all about. They have to parrot that narrative because that's all they have to assuage the anxieties and I would argue the guilt of their PMC audience for the fact that their president has been a catastrophic failure on every front. They have no answer for that. So they have to keep going back to the idea that, no, we stand for progress, and it's those deplorables that are standing in our way because they are anxious about progress. They are fearful of progress. This is a line that's been repeated for as long as I have followed politics. And it's a line that I used to swallow, hook, line, and sinker. I know Russell did too. And here you can see how ridiculous it is from the outside looking in once you've broken out of that mindset and out of that bubble.
This is what I don't understand. They vote against their own economic interests. I don't know why they do that. If you're poor, why don't you vote Democrat? Why do you vote Republican?
Right? Fuck it. it's for those people.
Controversial piece.
Right.
It gave us Karen Bass and people to keep us from reading it as racial. But we know that the real worry here is, a black woman. That's the real concern.
I don't know. If Karen Bass were the vice president, then Joe Biden would not be president anymore. If Karen Bass were Biden's running mate, Karen Bass would be the president right now. Biden would have resigned. If Stacey Abrams were his running mate, Biden would not be president right now. Stacey Abrams would be.
These people need racism, they need sexism, they need homophobia, they need transphobia, because without all of those things, they have to get into a critique of capitalism.
Right.
And that they cannot do. They need every explanation for social ills except for the explanation.
Right, because Donnie Deutsch inherited his father's advertising company for north of $200 million. And then I think he sold it for less than he inherited it for. So he's not a businessman. He's not a branding expert. He's a rich kid. Right.
Oh, he didn't.
Right. All right, now let's cut to the rest of this panel. This is Jennifer Palmieri, who was a Hillary Clinton advisor in 2016. And then I forget this other guy's name. I used to know his name, but I forget. He's like a Boston guy.
Yeah, I forget his name. All right, so I haven't watched these things in so long. And these people are such fucking interchangeable fucking androids. And, when we were preparing for the segment, I had the computer low, and the image is small.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I'm on a tablet, so I couldn't see it really well. And I kept mistaking these people for other people. So I thought she was Claire McCaskill. And, Keaton kept being like, no, that's not Claire McCaskill, that's Jennifer Palmieri. And I'm like, okay, so I haven't watched any of this kind of news in a very long time, and it's small, so I can't really see it very well.
Mike Barnacle, thank you, Rick. That's his name.
That's right. Beyond that, they're all like the same fucking person. Like, look at her. You're telling me she's not like on Claire McCaskill's timeline? Like she's not, the younger Claire McCaskill beamed in from a time machine? Like, they're all the same fucking person. Like, you could just take one out, plug another one in. They all sound the same. They all talk the same. They all offer the same opinions. They all have that same smug tone of insidery knowledge. Like, they're all just cocks.
Oh yeah, that's why one day it is Claire McCaskill, one day it's Jennifer Palmieri, right? Same thing. You swap them out as needed.
And you're gonna get that take.
All right, now listen to this take.
I'd say about her. I mean, first of all, the notion that that he would not keep her is ridiculous because for number A, it's
the notion you wouldn't keep her is ridiculous. Says the advisor to the Hillary Clinton campaign, says the loser of the most winnable election ever. She's giving advice about who should be on the ticket and who should not be on the ticket.
It's admitting defeat. It's admitting mistake. You would never do that. Also, I mean, black women voters, best voters in America, they would be, all of a sudden, everyone would rush to her side. All of a sudden, black women, white women, everybody would be on her side.
I'm sorry, what evidence do you have to support that claim? They had a chance to rush to her side in the 2020 primaries. They didn't. She was polling single digits. She was polling 5th place behind Andrew Yang in her home state of California. Andrew Yang got totally blacked out, wasn't allowed to hardly spoke at any of the debates, hardly got any press coverage, and he was out polling her in her own state, her home state of California, which is a massive state. So how does a guy with no advertising budget, no airtime, no oxygen given him by the media, how does he outpoll her in her home state if she has this support of people of color and women and young people that Jennifer Palmieri is claiming? Oh, they'll have her back if you try to push her off the ticket. Really? Really? First of all, whoever has Joe Biden's back at this point would have the back of any Democrat who ran, because you on MSNBC would tell them that they have to have their back. And everybody who's voting for Joe Biden are people who just take their orders from you guys anyway. So the idea that like the voters that the Democratic voters have any agency at all is nonsense. Whoever's left in the tank for Joe Biden is going to do whatever the fuck Jennifer Palmieri tells them to do anyway. It's about getting the swing voters. And Kamala Harris isn't getting a single swing. I mean, it's a joke. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, this panel and our whole political class really is a really good demonstration of what happens when there's no accountability for failure. Because as you point out, these are a bunch of fucking losers. These are a bunch of losers. I mean, Palmieri's a fucking loser. McCaskill too. McCaskill only won when she did win because she ran against a guy who tried to argue that a woman's body could shut down pregnancy if she didn't really want the sex. Okay, like she basically beat a werewolf. The next time she wasn't running against someone like that, she fucking lost.
Yeah,
she got blown out.
It wasn't close.
As soon as she loses, what do? They put her on fucking TV to give political strategy insights.
And by the way, the year that she lost re-election was 2018, the blue wave year. She got clobbered.
Right.
In the Senate.
That is how fucking terrible she was. And they literally brought her on to talk political analysis. So this is when
once
you
again,
know.
to avoid confusion, this is not Claire McCaskill. This is the woman that wrote
This is not
for Claire McCaskill. This is the other political genius, Jennifer Palmieri, one of the senior advisors to the Hillary Clinton campaign, whose track record is, of course, even worse than McCaskill's.
Right. But I'm lumping them all together because even on their own terms, even the way that they justify their elite status based on meritocracy, even that is completely collapsed. I mean, not just them. Fucking, people often comment all these Iraq War cheerleading fucking goons. They all have fucking contracts with these fucking networks. You got Bill Kristol, David Frum. All these fucking people are paid millions of dollars when they should be shunned. If it were really a meritocracy, these people you'd never hear from these people again. As soon as their acts in government blow up in the public's faces, they get jobs as commentators. I mean, at that point, you're really dealing with a dissolute aristocracy. How is this different from an aristocracy? That's exactly why aristocracies don't work, right? Because you wind up with the incompetent supporting the incompetent.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, especially going out and traveling, it's just incredible that the United States continues to occupy this position of power. And it's very clear. I mean, you don't have to leave the country to figure this out. It's not sustainable. No country this fucking absurd and badly managed can maintain a dominant global position for very long. We're just living off the fumes of past accomplishments now.
All right, let's keep going.
But more, I traveled with her recently to Iowa. I don't think Mike Pence had people show up, cheering throng showing up at the airport to greet him, or excited standing ovations, or big lines at HBCUs. She's on college tour right now. Like, that doesn't happen to other vice presidents. But the other thing that people, when Biden's not doing well in polls, it's because of young voters and voters of color. Okay? Yeah. That is why. So where is Kamala Harris really uniquely able to speak and motivate voters? It's that group, and that's what you see her out on the...
Once again, no evidence for any of that. No evidence for any of that, as we said earlier.
Campaign trail talking about. It's about Dobbs. It's about voting rights. It's about the economic record. And Dobbs. And when I went with her to Des Moines, it was about Dobbs because they had just passed a 6-week abortion ban. And you want to talk about passion and an audience.
She can speak to that beautifully, effectively, aggressively, and in a way people at this point, the majority of Americans are.
I should have pulled this. Now that I hear Mika say she can speak to that beautifully, don't you remember when Now I'm kicking myself for not pulling this video. But after the Dobbs ruling came down, they said, well, you know, what should you guys do now? And she's like, well, what do you mean do? Like, she gave some very clumsy answer to that. Yeah, God damn it. I blew that one. I should have had that one. But yeah, that's how beautifully and eloquently and passionately she speaks about that. Here's the zinger of the segment, folks, coming up right now.
Very concerned.
Yeah.
about
When you
this
look at
issue.
like what actually has to happen for this reelect, she's arguably the most valuable running mate that a president has had in a while.
She's the most valuable running mate that the president,
That is
any
amazing.
president has
That is
had
amazing.
in a while. The fact that she is clearly the biggest liability as a running mate that any president has had in a while is the only reason she's not the president. If she were an asset to the president, she'd fucking be president, because they don't want Biden to run again. Most voters don't want Biden to run again. Most insiders now are shitting their pants that he's going to lose. So if what you said had any basis at all in truth, she would be president. Like, the only reason she's not the president is because she's a massive liability. And you spin that as she's the greatest asset to a sitting president in a while in terms of vice presidents. Just astounding. Absolutely astounding.
Well, this is a result of the incentives, right? Like, look, you got a bunch of fucking incompetent losers who could not run a bodega sitting here opining about the nation's politics. To keep that job, they have to keep the people in power happy, right? That's how they keep that job. So they just say whatever shit the entrenched Democratic Party and their donor class want to hear. And it doesn't matter how outrageous it is, because there's no consequences for that. There would only be consequences for telling the truth.
Right.
If one of them went on there and said Kamala Harris is a liability and they need to take her off the ticket, they're going to get calls, right? They're going to get calls from the Biden White House. They're going to get calls. As long as they say shit like that, they're good, right? I mean, that's their job. Their job is to just spread whatever propaganda is going to make the people in power happy. And as you can see from the fact that they even have these jobs, competence and credibility is no barrier to entry.
Please clap.